Well, boys, I reckon this is it. Nuclear combat toe-to-toe with the Ruskies.
Peter George had knowledge coming from the RAF of many aircraft, the Vulcans, B-52s and the heavy nuclear bombers. One day he got this idea, as a Vulcan bomber was nearby, of what could happen if the pilot decided, I'm not going to turn around at my X point, but I'm going to carry on to my target. And that was the real first spark that Peter George had for Red Alert. He was a well-known writer in Britain, certainly. He was a jobbing writer in some respects. He wrote in several genres. These books were popular in the way that hardback novels at that time were. You could call them pulp fiction, but with Red Alert, that was the one that really seemed to take off because of the subject matter, and that was in 1958. Certainly in Britain, as I grew up, there was a lot of paranoia, the thought that we may well end up in a Third World War that would probably be very short and would not be particularly pleasant as nuclear bombs rained down on Britain. I don't think Peter George was any more paranoid than anyone else, but there again, he had the imagination to think how the unthinkable might happen. Stanley Kubrick first contacted Peter George about adapting the novel in a letter sent in November 1961, basically introducing himself and saying, this is the area I want to look at next, and I think your book comes very close to what I want. But he was very strong on wanting to check that the technical details that were gone into in Red Alert were accurate. I think that Stanley Kubrick was somebody who sought people out who could help him. Before he got in touch with Peter George, he had already been looking for the right ideas, talking to a lot of different people, such as Thomas Schelling and Herman Kahn. My father was the next cog in that wheel of Kubrick creating the film. If he wanted information and people had it, then he would collaborate with them. I think that's probably a fair enough thing to say. He was a pragmatist, let's put it like that. Peter's involvement in the initial script development with Stanley Kubrick was extensive across the various versions and iterations that it went through from the beginning. They were certainly friendly together. There was a professional relationship. Kubrick himself came to Hastings with his family on various occasions. My father referred to him as Stan, and they did develop a friendship. It was a good collaboration. It was Stanley Kubrick who suggested to Peter George as they were working that he was now starting to see it as a comedy. And what did Peter think of that, and would he be upset or whatever? And Peter George responded to it that he would be absolutely delighted, and that's what they then carried on to develop themselves.
We must be increasingly on the alert to prevent them.
It wasn't a funny book, definitely not. But in a way, the whole situation is comical of itself.
Mr. President, we must not allow a mine shaft gap.
The final satirical version was completed by late 1962. However, Peter was kept on as a technical advisor during pre-production and into production, December 62 to January 63. At the same time, Terry Southern was contracted to finish this comical, satirical script.
What's happened?
The Doomsday Machine.
The Doomsday Machine? What is that?
A device which will destroy all human and animal life on Earth.
All human and animal life?
The major differences between Peter George's Red Alert and the final film would be the Doomsday Machine is in there, but in the novel, it's triggered by the people themselves. It's not automatically triggered.
Is this gonna set off the Doomsday Machine?
All the rest of the film and the novel, the plots go side by side, 95% really. Basically, the three scenarios where you have the airbase, the plane, and the war room.
We have heard the wings of the angel of death.
And it's this intercutting between those three all the way through.
Dr. Strangelove, do we have anything like that in the works?
A moment, please, Mr. President.
Possibly the biggest difference is there is no Dr. Strangelove character in Red Alert.
Technology required is easily within the means of even the smallest nuclear power. It requires only the will to do so.
There are various ideas as to who Dr. Strangelove may be based on, going from Edward Teller to von Neumann to Herman Kahn. When the script was being developed, they had a character, first of all, called von Klutz, who became the Strangelove character. So this was a character in whom they could put certain ideas that were necessary for the way Kubrick wanted to develop the plot of the film beyond the plot of Red Alert itself. As far as I can tell, the character of Strangelove was written by Peter George in the spring of 1962, after the transition of von Klutz to the name Strangelove. But it's not the character as we would see him in the film. If you think the character in the film is actually very briefly etched out, there's very little we find out about him, apart from the fact he's German, and he came across presumably after the war. I think you have to remember that Dr. Strangelove, the film, went through various iterations, as I would call them. There was another title in use at one point, The Delicate Balance of Terror. At the beginning, it was not going to be as close to Red Alert, the novel, and then Kubrick went back to that, so it was much closer to it. So I think this would have been part of the development. My father wrote a series of notes coming out at 7,000 to 8,000 words, looking at the background of Dr. Strangelove and where he could have come from and how he came to be in the position he occupies in the film. It was an early attempt to do the background details of a character, which is where the interest is. He is a professor at what he describes as a middling university. He includes what he calls Strangelove's theory, which is about nuclear proliferation. So the character of Strangelove develops this theory, produces a book, which is taken up by the establishment as such. And he then becomes their sort of nuclear experts because he can say all the right things that the government wants to hear about, keeping the arms manufacturing up. In other words, keeping all elements of American society happy in terms of keeping everyone in work and making sure there's lots of money spent on national defence. Now, that is in the character of Strangelove.
But I would guess that dwelling space for several 100,000 of our people could easily be provided.
Well, I would hate to have to decide who stays up and who goes down.
Well, that would not be necessary, Mr. President. Could easily be accomplished with a computer.
There is always some information about his physical appearance and what sort of person he was in terms of a physical character. But he is certainly not in a wheelchair. There is the talk that Peter Sellers was going to play King Kong at the controls of the B-52, and also that he did something to his ankle. Now, whether that's the reason that Peter Sellers was maybe using that as an excuse so he didn't have to get up into the B-52, I don't know. My father, he himself was happy with the film, absolutely. Who wouldn't be? And I think he learns an awful lot from the whole exercise and working with Stanley Kubrick. In fact, he dedicated his following novel, Commander One, to Stanley Kubrick. The impact on me personally of my father's involvement with Dr. Strangelove is I'm incredibly proud. The fact that the book that Peter George wrote, Red Alert, was so close to the plot that was used for the film in terms of literally scene by scene, that in other words, without the book Red Alert, there may have been another film, but it wouldn't have been Doctor Strangelove as we know it at all.